We hear it all the time, right? Science has killed God. It's settled. But what if that's completely backward? Today, we're going to dive into a pretty stunning argument from Professor John Lennox, who says that, actually, modern science might be digging a grave for atheism. All right, so let's get right into it. The narrative we're all fed is pretty simple. You've got to pick a side. It's either science or it's God. You can't have both. But according to Professor Lennox, this is a huge mistake. A totally false choice that we don't need to make. So where did this whole God versus science battle even begin? Well, it's been pushed pretty hard by some of the biggest names in science. Yeah, the basic idea, which you'll hear from giants like Richard Dawkins or the late, great Stephen Hawking, is that God and science are like two boxers in a ring. They're seen as rival explanations, and you have to bet on one. But Lennox comes in and says, hold on a second. This whole fight is based on a couple of massive misunderstandings. So what's mistake number one? Well, it's a really fundamental one. It comes down to being confused about the very kind of God we're even discussing. Okay, this right here is absolutely crucial. On one hand, you've got what's called the God of the gaps. Think of it like a shrinking piece of territory. In ancient times, maybe this God was responsible for lightning. Then science figured out electricity, and poof, that God's job disappeared. The more science explains, the smaller this God gets. But Lennox says that's not the God of the Bible at all. The biblical God is the creator God. He's the reason there's a universe with lightning and electricity and everything else to begin with. He's not a competitor to science. He's the very reason science is possible. And you can see this perfectly with someone like Isaac Newton. I mean, come on, one of the greatest scientists ever. For him, figuring out the laws of gravity didn't push God away. No, it did the opposite. The more he understood how elegantly the whole system worked, the more he was in awe of the genius mind that must have designed it. All right, so that's the first misunderstanding. Ready for the second one? This is all about realizing that science and God, well, they're not even answering the same questions. They're offering totally different types of explanations. And to make this super clear, let's use a simple analogy. Just picture a kettle boiling on a stove. And I ask you a simple question. Hey, why is the water boiling? Well, a scientist could give you one answer. They'd say, the gas flame is transferring heat energy to the kettle, which agitates the H2O molecules, increasing their kinetic energy until they reach 100 degrees Celsius and transition into a gaseous state. And you know what? That explanation is 100% correct. It's the how. But there's another answer that is also 100% correct. The water is boiling because I want a cup of tea. That's an explanation of purpose, of my personal intention. It's the why. So, you see, does the science explanation compete with my tea explanation? No, of course not. They're not enemies, they're partners. They're what we call complementary explanations. One tells you about the mechanics, the other tells you about the agent and their purpose. You actually need both for the full story. And Lennox just nails this with another great analogy. Saying science explains the universe, so we don't need a creator, is like saying the laws of internal combustion and aerodynamics explain the Model T, so we don't need Henry Ford. It just doesn't make sense. Of course you need both. You need the science and the agent who used that science to create something. Okay, so once we clear up those two big mistakes, we see that the science versus God thing is kind of a phantom conflict. And this is where Lennox completely flips the script. He says the real conflict isn't between science and God at all. He argues it's actually between science and atheism. And this is his big, bold claim. He says, look, has science buried God? The answer is no. But has science buried atheism? Well, that's a different story. He thinks it just might. Whoa, how could that possibly be true? Well, it all comes down to a really deep philosophical problem. A problem with the one tool that every single scientist has to trust completely, their own mind, human reason itself. Okay, let's just walk through this logically. 1, science depends entirely on our ability to think rationally, right? 2, we do that thinking with our brains. 3, now, if you're a naturalist or an atheist, you believe that the brain is the end product of a long, mindless, unguided process, just atoms bumping around over billions of years. So that brings us to the killer question number 4. If our brain is just the result of a cosmic accident, why on earth should we trust anything it tells us? Lennox has this amazing way of putting it. He asks, imagine you found out that the computer you're using was just a random fluke, not designed, just the product of a mindless, accidental process. Would you trust its calculations, He's asked famous scientists this, and they all say the same thing: no way. So, the big question is, why do we trust our brains if we believe they are the product of that very same kind of process? And this gets to a really deep point. We're always told science is about facts, religion is about faith, but it's not so simple. To even begin doing science, you have to take a huge leap of faith. You have to believe that the universe is rational and orderly, and even more, that our tiny little minds are capable of understanding it. So it's not a question of science versus faith. The real question becomes, which worldview, theism or atheism, gives you a better reason, a better foundation for having that faith in a rational universe in your own mind? And here is the real kicker. This isn't some newfangled argument that religious thinkers just came up with. This exact same problem, this deep, nagging doubt, it actually troubled the father of evolutionary theory himself. That's right, we're talking about Charles Darwin. He personally wrestled with what he called his horrid doubt, and it came directly out of his own theory. He literally wrote, "The horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy." Just let that sink in. Darwin himself is asking, if my mind is just an upgraded version of an ape's mind, why should I trust any of its conclusions? I mean, that includes his own theory of evolution. It's this incredible self-destruct button at the heart of the idea. So that leaves us with this final massive question to chew on. The entire foundation of science, of everything we think we know, is our reason. But if the atheistic worldview is true, that foundation of reason is itself just an accident, a product of a mindless process you wouldn't trust to build your laptop. So, what does it mean if the worldview that champions science actually ends up destroying the very reason we should trust it in the first place?